everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the fourth WERA and Human Rights Education Review webinar of this series 2022, and a very warm welcome to everyone. I'd like to alert everyone here that this webinar is being recorded, and so you have been warned that this will be available afterwards. It would be really very nice if you not only mute yourselves, but those of you who can, open up your pictures to us so that the presenter gets a feel of who is there and where you are from around the world. Okay, I'm going to start formally now. Good afternoon, everyone, and those of you that isn't afternoon and maybe some other time of a day, a very warm welcome to you all. This is the fourth seminar in the webinar series run by the WERA Human Rights Education International Research Network, and we're very, very pleased to have you here with us. The seminar is also co-hosted by Human Rights Education Review, and I just have one or two small messages for you all before I introduce this afternoon's speaker. First of all, I should introduce myself. I know many of you. My name is Audrey Osler, and I'm the Editor-in-Chief of Human Rights Education Review and also the co-convener of the WERA IRN seminar series, along with Hugh Starkey, who's also here tonight. We've just published our latest edition of Human Rights Education Review this month, so I do invite you all to take a look at that if you've not had a chance to yet. And I believe Piers, who's our technical host this evening, will be posting a link to you all in the chat line here. We really encourage you to take a look at the journal, but we also invite new submissions. We are open to new submissions. We don't have a special call at any time of year, but new submissions are welcome both from established scholars and from doctoral researchers. So if you have some research in the field of human rights education, research and scholarship from any country in the world, please take a look and please consider us as the home, the possible future home of your work. The webinar series, as I've said, is being recorded this afternoon, and you can take a look at past webinars on our YouTube channel, and Piers will also shortly, I'm sure, post the YouTube information to you. We're not that easy to find on YouTube because we're not as popular as some of the great stars of the globe, but if you go to the site and take a look, you will find our address and use it. You'll see all the seminars that have run this year and last year, and there are some very, very interesting speakers there. And finally, in terms of the links that you will receive this afternoon, I'm going to introduce our speaker in a moment, but her paper is also available to download for free. It's open access and it's on Human Rights Education Review's platform. And we do encourage you, if you've not yet had a chance to look at the paper, perhaps to go after the paper, after the seminar, after the webinar, and take a look. In terms of practicalities of this evening, we ask you to keep the chat line free for questions. We'd like you to start thinking about your questions, or if you have a question, to pose it as soon as you think about it, rather than save it for the end. It doesn't mean we won't take questions at the end, but we'll get a sense of what's coming up and have a chance to organize those questions, hopefully, and hopefully get everyone who wants to speak speaking. So if you are passionate about saying something, please do post your question, because we normally have more people speaking, trying to speak than get the chance to. So those are all the housekeeping details. And now it's my very, very big pleasure to welcome Dr. Ida Pugh from the University of Helsinki to this seminar. We don't normally emphasize people's titles, but I'm stressing Dr. Pugh because she has just been awarded her doctorate this summer at the University of Helsinki. And not only has she just received it, but she's received it with distinction, which I understand to be a very, very rare honor indeed. So we've got, I believe, one of the most exciting researchers of her generation speaking this evening. Ida graduated in May, and I think she's actively involved both in the community and in the university. So she works on practical human rights issues with enabling women and particularly mothers into work in Finland. And she's worked as a human rights trainer for UNICEF. And she's also a practicing teacher. She has experience of working with children in classrooms. So she's bringing a very, very rich combination of experiences to our webinar this evening. I could talk endlessly about her, and I'm one of her biggest fans, but I'm going to hand over now to Ida to speak directly to you and thank her very warmly for coming at this time of year, which is the very, very end of the academic year in the Nordic region. So we're lucky to have her with us, and welcome to Ida and to all of you from around the globe, but particularly those of you from Helsinki who I know have come along to support her. Please.
Wow, hello, hello. And thank you, Professor Osler, for that, Audrey, for that wonderful introduction, made me blush. I'm super happy to be here today. Before I say anything, let me just share my screen. Piers, can you just, it says host disabled, participant screen sharing. So, yep, now I can do it. Great. And just let me know if you can see it okay. Great, wonderful. As Audrey mentioned, I research political emotions, and I have just recently defended my doctoral dissertation. And today I am actually going to be talking about one specific emotion, and that is compassion. And I will be talking about compassion in the context of human rights education, naturally. What else is there to say? Yeah, I'm based in Uni Helsinki. My pronoun is she. And without further ado, let's get going. Let me see. So I hope some of you have read the paper. Those of you who haven't, my presentation is based on an article that was published in Human Rights Education Review last autumn. And in this paper, I actually used this debated novel of To Kill a Mockingbird as an example, and I kind of connect that with the Black Lives Matter movement, and I also draw from my own experiences. In this presentation today, I decided not to use any examples from that novel, but to very much focus on the definitions of some of the terms and presenting my central arguments. So if you haven't read the paper, go and have a look at how I used the novel To Kill a Mockingbird there. Furthermore, this presentation is part of a bigger research project. So in the past years, I have been looking at political emotions and their significance to democratic education in the era of political polarization and escalating global crisis. So this is just for you to have a look at my other publications if you're interested. So this article started with the question, in addressing human rights issues such as racist discriminations, what skills should education nurture, and then how could these skills be taught in classrooms? And while I was trying to answer this question, I brought in two central concepts from Martha Nussbaum's philosophy. One of them is political compassion, and the other one is narrative imagination. And I was curious to know how these two concepts could actually inform human rights education. So I kind of wanted to further develop the theory, and this is in fact quite a theoretical paper. While I was doing this, I also wanted to be mindful of certain critical considerations. So in this presentation, I am going to visit some Nussbaum critiques and compassion critiques as well. All in all, I will argue that Martha Nussbaum's work can provide an interesting and important perspective on contemporary human rights education. I have many reasons for this, but most importantly, I argue that this compassion that is actually active and profound and critical is important for human rights because it can motivate people to commit to somewhat abstract normative principles. How also I will argue that bringing political compassion and narrative imagination into the context of human rights education can actually move us, hopefully, towards more reflective and effective education so that we could advance human rights without falling into this trap of empty sentimentality or so-called unthinking goodwill. So this is how this presentation is going to unfold. I will first do some definitions, then I will talk about Nussbaum's theory of political emotions. Then I will explain what narrative imagination is and how it could be potentially a method for awakening compassion. I also visit some critiques, and then I draw from these critiques as I present my own suggestions on how human rights education could be informed by these two concepts by Nussbaum. But then my favorite topic, what are political emotions? Well, Western political philosophy has traditionally seen emotions as inferior to rationality. Although in recent years, especially in recent decades, there has been an increasing interest in political or public feelings in various disciplines, also in education. And I define emotions as political, both in terms of their object and in terms of their expression. And it's very important here to highlight that political emotions are not merely private sensations, but they are shared experiences, and they have a significant role, particularly in the formation of collective identities. However, as a disclaimer, I want to let everyone know that I am well aware of the complexity of this issue, and by no means do I mean to kind of advocate this psychologism, which means that I would be drawing causal connections and also casual connections between social structures and individual emotions. So this is not what I am after at all. Then zooming in on compassion. So in the field of education, scholars from very theoretical and epistemological interests have stressed the value of teaching with and for compassion. So there seems to be some kind of agreement that compassion is good and we should be nurturing it in education. However, more theoretical work has been called for to really consider how particular political dispositions can then be thought so that they will lead to compassionate action. So this is the gap that I am kind of trying to fill. So Nussbaum's theory of political emotions. Well, obviously Nussbaum has spent decades theorizing political emotions, and I argue that her theory is particularly beneficial and relevant if one is interested in the tensions and possibilities involved in education about or towards certain emotions. And Nussbaum's theory is particularly valuable if one is interested in strengthening democracy or let's say, strengthening the culture of human rights. And of course, Nussbaum's political philosophy is well, her body of work is massive. So, and I do see many connections between Nussbaum's theory and human rights education. However, I'm not going to go into those in this presentation. So if you're interested in capabilities approach or something else, perhaps you can email me and we can discuss it at another occasion. And Nussbaum, she defines emotions as cognitive judgments, which means that emotions are intertwined with the way we receive information about the world and the way we communicate information to others. Nussbaum also states that emotions are value judgments. So emotions tell us something about what is meaningful to us. And I follow this conceptualization. To give an example, perhaps, well, a political emotion of climate anxiety. If someone is feeling grief due to the loss of biodiversity, that tells that person something about their values. Most likely they value the natural world, for instance. Yeah, and then here are some of Nussbaum's central arguments. Well, first of all, she says that abstract principles and rationality is not enough to mobilize people politically. We need emotions. Also, she urges that collaboration and attachment that are basic human wants need to be put into political practice through nurturing certain emotions. And then very importantly, Nussbaum's theory is normative, not descriptive. So she says that political emotions always need to be informed by a vision of a good life. And although this vision might be redefinable and debatable and partial, it needs to be set in some sort of shared normative goals. And we could, for instance, think human rights as this type of normative goals. From this, it follows that not all emotions are equally beneficial for democracy. Some emotions should be nurtured and others maybe not. So if we think about the future of democracy, perhaps racist hate or disgust are not so useful and beneficial as trust, hope, and compassion. And I definitely follow Nussbaum's theory in that I view emotions as not static, but as some like things that are constantly shaped through social norms and context. And I do believe that we should kind of do our best to develop our emotions so that they could be channeled towards more constructive designs. Then compassion, Nussbaum defines it as an emotion that is directed at the serious suffering of another creature or creatures. And compassion definitely contains a strong cognitive element. It is about something. It tells us something about the things that we value. And following Aristotle, Nussbaum defines compassion as an emotion that involves the recognition of one's own vulnerability that then can lead to this kind of recognition of shared human vulnerability. And not only Nussbaum, but many other philosophers also connect compassion to this moral thought and think of it as an emotion that connects the community and the individual. Sarah Ahmed has stated that compassion can open up the lines of communication. So it's kind of, compassion is needed to make the sacrifices that are ultimately always required for public welfare. Let's say it can motivate people to pay more taxes. A very banal example. Yeah, and Nussbaum argues that compassion can at least enable us to kind of imagine the individuality and circumstances of other people. And this way, maybe we might be less inclined to demonize person or people and to think of someone as purely evil, purely alien. And as we all know, when a person or people are dehumanized, it's like very much easier to justify all sorts of cruelties. So yeah, so if we then accept this conceptualization of compassion, I argue that compassion becomes highly significant for our work for social justice and human rights. Then some compassion critiques. Some scholars kind of think that compassion cannot cannot exist without this patronizing pity. It has been said to be selective and unreliable. It has also been suggested that compassion is actually too passive an effect to create persistence against injustice, whereas then emotions, let's say maybe more negative emotions such as anger, outrage, can be especially crucial in minority struggles, and they can kind of provide the motivation to stand against oppression, whereas compassion as a more passive, maybe more positive emotion does not have this power. Then there is this one very real danger of people thinking that they have already done something morally righteous just by the virtue of feeling compassion. But compassion in itself is not enough. It needs to lead to something. Like, where is the action? Then this last point is highly relevant in the context of education, because the claim here is that if students or any people are kind of exposed to an excessive amount of information on suffering, it might detach spectators, and it might cause anxiety, self-pity, hopelessness, and the so-called compassion fatigue. And this way, if compassion is seen as something that is inflicted from above, or it's somehow passive as like, oh, there's nothing to be done for the to the suffering in the world, then educators might actually be they might get outcomes that are the opposite than what they hoped for. So yeah, this is a real issue. So what I propose is this kind of critically reflective compassion. And I am strongly influenced by human rights education scholar Mikalino Sembula's work. He talks about strategic empathy. So in the article, I make a distinction between compassion and pity and empathy. I'm not going to go into it now. I also follow Nussbaum's distinction between limited compassion that is usually aroused by an individual narrative of distress, and then this extended public political compassion. And I argue that this political compassion, that's the one I am interested in, always is active, because it entails this call for action, and political compassion always needs to be mindful of structural injustice. It's not just this naive, oh, I'm feeling for this person, but the political already states that this compassion is towards something greater than an individual. Yeah, I also want to point out that the fact that I advocate cultivating compassion in education does not mean that we do not need to strengthen societal and democratic institutions such as law at the same time. I don't think the two are mutually exclusive. I also, in the article, I propose that we need to widen our sphere of compassion. And this is not easy. It's easy to feel compassion towards a family member or a friend or someone who is like us, but it's more difficult to feel compassion towards distant others. So I kind of suggest that this could take place in 4 steps, and this is something I might have to develop further in my work. But first, there is this realizing of one's own vulnerability, which can then lead to recognition of common human fragility. And hopefully, when you start thinking like, oh, we're all vulnerable, then you might realize, but yeah, like I am vulnerable, but in this society, I am not in as vulnerable a position as that person. So maybe there is some kind of a power asymmetry here. Like maybe I should be more compassionate towards that person than someone like myself. So yeah, and hopefully, so this would then lead to, I don't know, like further reflection of power structures and asymmetries. Okay, now we're moving on. So that was political compassion. Now we're moving on towards narrative imagination. So when I use the term narrativity, I refer to it in its widest sense. So practice, art, interpretation of shared fictional, semi-fictional, or non-fictional stories. And narratives, well, human beings, or we as human beings, we love stories. And it has been actually argued that human beings are innate storytellers. Stories, narratives are very powerful in circulating knowledge and enforcing cooperation. And especially now in the recent years, we have witnessed this expansion of instrumental storytelling. This has been prompted by identity politics, by civil rights movements, and the narrative turn in social sciences and humanities. Also, I want to highlight here that social media is drastically altering our narrative environments and also our students' narrative environments. And also education is a narrative practice, or it can be viewed as such because it constructs and reconstructs personal and social stories. Okay, and in human rights education, narratives have been examined quite a lot. This is perhaps because they do persist as ways in which to evoke feelings and to share information about human rights successes and human rights violations. Then, narrative imagination. This is a central concept in Nussbaum's educational account. So now I was talking more about Nussbaum's theory of political emotions, and here I am talking more about her educational philosophy, although the two are intertwined, and I try to kind of connect them in my own work. So narrative imagination has also been said to be, or some people say imaginative understanding or use some other kind of terms, but Nussbaum defines it as the ability, and I would even maybe add a virtue, to be an intelligent reader of another person's story, striving to understand the lives, emotions, and wishes of others. So then I wanted to explore the role of narrative imagination in developing political compassion, because the question was, how can compassion be developed? So Nussbaum argues that stories are wonderful preparation for moral interaction. And actually research shows like quite an evident connection between literature and pro-social behavior. And when I talk about, like I said, when I talk about narrative art, I talk about all forms of art, not just literature. So it's not the format that I'm interested in. Through narrative art, I argue, following Nussbaum and Aristotle, for instance, that we can live more than one life. And maybe we will be able to understand people that maybe come from groups that the media or other forces might portray as alien. And I'm not saying that it's absolutely possible and we can get an insight into someone else's reality. No, but I am moderately optimistic that via narrative art, we could perhaps move beyond our identity positionings and our historic, social, cultural, national context, at least for a while. At least it could make us think. And I think that when we read a story, this gradual moral education kind of happens. Like we discover what happens in a story and we might get emotionally involved. Then we are reflecting, imagining what's going to happen next. What would I do in this situation? I don't understand this person's practical reasoning. And then we start seeking similarities in real life stories and phenomena. And like Aristotle already said, our lives are always limited. We have never lived enough. So this means that although we might live in pluralistic societies, and although we might encounter other people in classrooms or at the office or somewhere, I argue that there is no way we are going to meet everyone. Our societies are definitely full of like sharp separations between people. We can see this political polarization rising all around the world. And it's just even in, let's say, even in a comprehensive school in Finland that has usually historically been pretty good at leveling out different social inequalities, it's getting more and more segregated. So where our lives are limited and we can never meet everyone, narrative art is limitless. And art, in a way, it does not present us only with everything that is, but also everything that can be and everything that could be. And this can also lead us to discussing of utopias that I did not write about in this article, but I know is a very interesting topic. So yeah, I believe that then through this art, we could maybe encounter other people and other creatures in that story. And this way we get a very rare positionality where we can examine things profoundly yet from afar. And this also creates a sense of psychological safety. The same issue is discussed actually by Bitte Goldschmidt-Kierlov in one of her articles published in Human Rights Education Review, where she examines Nussbaum's narrative imagination in the context of teaching about very tricky issues such as child sexual abuse. So yeah, I definitely recommend you to go and have a look at that paper. So this psychological safety kind of leads us to these critical considerations. So yeah, storytelling is influential, but also a disputable form of cultural production. And then I do call for critical reevaluation of the risks associated with the use of narratives, no matter how noble the intentions. And many other scholars have done this as well. Mäkelä is also warning us of this radical storification. So this means that we're only focusing on individual experience. And this becomes problematic because if we only focus on personal stories and individual experiences, we risk losing sight of the macro level complex phenomena. And yeah, maybe, then although I do agree with Nussbaum with many of her points, I still hold that human rights education has these multi-perspectival and partial dimensions in it that Nussbaum's theory does not fully capture. And sometimes Nussbaum's language can almost imply that one has access to someone else's mind and someone else's position. And this is definitely a troubling view from the perspective of radically local or feminist perspectives, for instance. So yeah, I am aware of this Nussbaum critique and I kind of see where it's coming from. Yeah, then the last section of this presentation is going to focus more on this, well, what should be done question. So how to develop political compassion in human rights education by practicing narrative imagination. And I make some suggestions in the paper. Here I'm briefly going to go through them, and the suggestions are structured so as to draw from the critiques already presented. And I kind of stress that there are these three imperatives that I think could ensure that we understand the locality and contextuality of human rights education. And these are very crucial so that compassion teaching does not become dominated by a single perspective, often articulated from a relative position of power. So firstly, I call for a safe learning environment with a capable pedagogue. And I'm an ex-teacher and I still teach at the university. So I am always looking at teachers and I have a massive respect for the profession. So yeah, this is why I always want to start with the teacher. And although I think that educators should not recoil from difficult human rights topics and the related emotions, because there are various benefits in addressing these, still I hold that specific caution is required when turning to narrative imagination as a method. And here I want to stress that the teacher must know their group and they must know their students and their backgrounds, because classroom exists in very specific context and children enter the classroom with all their positionings in terms of various privileges. So this point also has to do with psychological safety. Teachers need to be, I think that teachers need to be creating this classroom environment that is both safe, inclusive, and also stimulating. This is the prerequisite in any educational endeavor. And Zembulas and al. Have actually written about this. They have a more empirical article about this psychological safety in human rights education teaching. Yeah, then another point is that when we are reading the others' stories, I think that a critical, reflective, and compassionate approach is needed. So in my article, I kind of highlight that compassion always needs to go hand in hand with critical reflection. And in practice, practicing critical self-examination and reflection involves this quite difficult task of stepping out of one's comfort zones and really learning to recognize asymmetries of suffering and possible privileges. It also involves admitting and being humble about the fact that you might not be able to know everyone's pain. For instance, I am not a refugee person. I might never be able to feel their pain, and it might be arrogant of me to suggest that I'm able to do that. However, I claim that even though without claiming that we can take the other's position, we can still feel compassion and try to highlight the shared nature of suffering and human dignity. Also, I always emphasize kind of framing social justice issues as shared and highlighting the structural nature of injustices. Although we can use individual narratives to evoke compassion, it's important to take the next step and kind of frame it as a shared issue. Let's take one example. Well, rape is a personal tragedy, but it's also a political issue, and we should care. It has to do with power. And speaking of power, the last part has to do with thinking about who has historically had the right to narrate. And in citizenship discourses, this has too often been white, non-disabled, heterosexual male. So I am kind of proposing taking these counter narratives into human rights education if we want to practice narrative imagination. So here the counter refers to the resistance to traditional domination. And counter narratives are not merely about representation or stories located in the margins. It's not about supporting character in a Netflix show representing a marginalized group. No, it's about people who are not in positions of relative power owning their stories and narrating them. And counter narratives could definitely elaborate the language of human rights. And here I definitely want to recommend Rebecca Adami's work. She visions human rights education and classrooms as relational spaces where plurality and uniqueness can be expressed. So Adami is not only interested in what type of narratives we are hearing or reading, but she's also interested in how we listen, read, interpret, and respond and react. Adami takes issue with Nussbaum's account, and I respond to that critique in the paper. I'm not going to expand on that now. Then, some concluding remarks before we can get to that discussion. I argue that political compassion is required for the work of social justice, and that human rights education can actually have quite a central and fertile role in its cultivation. However, I also stress that practicing solidarity necessitates that we address structural inequalities, as oppression is definitely more than feelings and thoughts and emotions. And although these democratic principles and institutions are important, I'm not saying that they're not important. I'm just saying that I am interested in political emotions, and I am interested how these emotions could perhaps support these democratic institutions. Then finally, I then state that critical reflectivity should intersect all educational practice. So no reading or teaching should be oversimplified or should take place without reflection. This includes human rights education and the utilization of narratives in teaching. A teacher should ask oneself, like, do I need a story here? Why am I presenting this story? Are there certain problems? what are the possible interpretations, and so on. Also, I think that although I advocate for political compassion, compassion itself should be kind of questioned and reflected upon, and it could be discussed with students. What is this emotion? Where is it coming from? Is it beneficial? Is it not? And where could it lead? So in my work, I always say that political emotions can only be made beneficial if they are explicitly discussed and debated and understood. Yeah, in the future, I hope to see more research that addresses the relation between emotions, human rights, and social justice. And I would like to conduct this type of research myself. And finally, when someone asks, can Nussbaum's work really inform human rights education? I say that, yeah, it can inform contemporary human rights education theory and practice, particularly if it is placed in dialogue with the critical considerations that I have proposed here. And also maybe some new critical considerations I haven't even taken into account. Here are my references. You can find me on social media. You can send me emails, and below you can see my affiliations. Go and check out our DemoPol project. And yeah, thank you so much for your attention. Let's have that discussion now.
Thank you very much indeed, Ida. You've presented us with such a rich presentation today, and we have amongst us a very richly endowed audience, in the sense that we come from many parts of the world. I've seen colleagues from South Africa, from the Philippines, from across Europe, and probably places that I've not yet spotted. While we're waiting for questions to come up, I'd like to put one myself, and this is it's partly about the diversity of narratives, but it's also about our school systems as they stand. And I'm wondering whether, when we talk about the right to narrate, and we think about who our teachers are in contemporary Europe, let's say, as a starting point, our teachers are not drawn from such a rich range of experiences as we might hope for. We don't necessarily attract teachers from minority backgrounds. And I'm just wondering whether this prerequisite, the diversity of narratives, is really possible when school curricula, as I have seen them, are so concerned with the nation, with one narrow concept of who the nation is. So if we take the system I've been through in Britain, I studied history from the age of 5 through to university, and I didn't really get a range of perspectives. And however many stories I was told, and I was told stories from different cultures and backgrounds, I wonder really whether developing political compassion through narrative is really achievable, or whether we need to start pressurizing and campaigning for a different kind of framework of learning.
Yes, that is an excellent comment and also a question. Definitely. And well, yeah, you talked about contemporary Europe, but at least in Finland, teachers have a lot of autonomy in their teaching. So then it becomes even more central, like who the teacher is. And the teacher's background plays even more of a pivotal role there. So definitely, maybe it should, if I'm just like now from the top of my head answering, maybe this could start from a level of like curricular level, but then again, like we're all practicing national core curricula of some sort. So I have seen when I was, well, it's very difficult. Like when I was attending school and I was studying history, it was very much still Finnish history and European history. Now I have heard that it's it's changing a little bit. And I can see actually on the line, we have Pia Mikander, who is a researcher of history and social sciences teaching in Finland. So it has very much, thank goodness, changed from the time where, for instance, colonialism was taught quite naively and only certain stories and narratives were being shared. So that's one positive thing. So I would like to say that perhaps time, research, collaboration between curriculum makers and researchers, I think that is that's one of the knots, I think, where change can happen. Teacher education is another one. What kind of, is this nationalistic discourse being pushed there, or are teacher educators provided with a variety of narratives? And are they provided even with like tools how to then take these narratives into their own teaching? That's another point of change, I think, like discussion between curriculum writers and researchers, but then also teacher education. I see potential in those 2 points.
Thank you. Do we have questions? Do we have comments from colleagues?
Hi.
Please.
Hi.
Hi. Good morning, everyone. It's 12 a.m. in the Philippines. I'm in Manila. And Lida, I appreciate your presentation, and your work is somehow related to my interest in doing human rights education work. I have 2 questions, if you don't mind. Number 1 is, how do you deal with conflicting political emotions? In the Philippines, we have an outgoing president. Tomorrow, we will have a new president, the son of the former dictator, Ferdinand Marcos. So it's a very interesting time in the country. The outgoing president is accused of extrajudicial killing. And people, 4 out of 5 Filipinos, they do not agree with extrajudicial killing, yet this president is still the most popular president ever, the outgoing President Duterte. That's my first question, because there is conflicting political emotion when it comes to that. Second, the incoming president, the son of the former dictator, whose family plundered the entire country for 20 years, is now going to be the next president of the country. My second question is, how might narrative imagination be a tool against manipulating political emotions? Because from where I am, having seen how the Marcoses manipulated the compassion, because now 31 million Filipinos voted for Marcos, and it seems that compassion is toward the Marcoses rather than the victims of the Marcoses. So these are 2 of my questions. Thank you, Lida.
Thank you.
Thank you, Felice. Thank you for asking these questions. And I was hoping that someone would ask something about the negative, let's say, influences of political emotions. And I have actually, this article is the only one where I discuss positive political emotions. I myself discuss a lot of, I have also been writing about anger and fear and how, let's say, certain populistic parties might exploit those emotions and kind of feel those emotions in order to gain more popularity. So obviously there's always going to be conflict in political emotions. And then you ask that, can narrative imagination be a tool against manipulating political emotion? Well, of course, again, it depends on a narrative, but it's often when something happens, I would say that yes, it can. Often when something happens, let's say that this abortion laws in the US are now causing a lot of discussion. there's always someone saying like, now we are living in Handmaid's Tale, and they are kind of referring to Handmaid's Tale, and everyone who has read the book and watched the movie is like, oh no, like it reminds them of something. This narrative is it's so well known, and it has influenced so many people, and so many people are emotionally invested in it, that it starts kind of maybe affecting our political emotions as well. This way, I think that narrative imagination can maybe combat certain negative influences of political emotions if those narratives can actually widen our sphere of compassion, or make us kind of examine things from various points of view. I'm not even saying that we need to feel compassion. I'm just saying that we need to examine situations from different perspectives. And often politicians are only offering one perspective, one great story that then everyone wants to follow.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ida. And I think the question by default also raises the question of how do, and not that I'm proposing we discuss it now, but how do the development of political emotions balance against basic knowledge and critical understanding in education? Because clearly people are more likely to be swayed one way if they're understanding, if they don't know how to interpret sources of information, if they can't interpret knowledge, if they can't look critically. So that's a very key question too. I think I can't see anybody asking to speak other than Hugh. Hugh, would you like to your question? We welcome others while he's talking.
Right. Ali also has a question in the
Okay.
chat, and Anne Becker has her hand up.
Right.
My question really followed very much on from Felice's question. It's perhaps too similar, but when I've just been talking about the way the French education system as a whole requires respect for the French Republic and a particular set of symbols. And obviously, when you're talking about symbols like the flag, the national anthem, and so on, these are emotional attachments. So the whole education system is geared to promoting an emotional attachment to a particular way of organizing society that may actually be very exclusive of the lived realities of many of its citizens. And so my question was how you see narrative imagination helping where you've already got such a strong narrative. It can even be an ethno-narrative, ethno-nationalist narrative in some cases.
Definitely, that is such a good question, Hugh, and it made me think that often it's not a new thing to advocate for these emotions. Like, and I'm always saying, like, the emotions are already there now, and they're up for grabs in a way. And it's, yeah, especially like emotions that have to do with national pride are kind of often in many educational institutions viewed as something that are accepted, that it's a virtue to be nationalistic. So what I am saying is that, hey, everyone else is, and let's say all the radical right-wing parties are using emotions and all the time. Like, why should we then not try to use emotions to kind of cultivate world citizenship, or maybe not world citizenship, but this more, let's say, cosmopolitan attitude towards the world? So, and I actually read. Sometimes, or when I read books that are so-called counter-narratives, I've read some, like young immigrant male story from Sweden. And it's like, and then reading this story, just like, it gives me such a different perspective from like what I have of Sweden when I talk to my cousins who live there, or when I read the news, or when I watch some Swedish series. So what I have done now is like, I really want to, nowadays I'm seeking for these counter narratives, because I want to understand more. I want to see another narrative than the one that is usually being served to us. So yeah, I think in Hugh, especially in your question, I think the use of counter narratives might be the key to kind of, let's say, fight back that ethno-nationalistic view.
Thanks, Ida. We have two people wishing to speak, and what I'm going to do is ask each of them to pose their question and then see as far as you can get with the answer to that, because we just have 4 minutes left. So Ali, can you pose your question, and then Anne pose yours to follow, either question or comment? Ali, can you go ahead?
Yes, thank you so much. What I'm interested in hearing is how you see narrative imagination interacting with educational technology and e-learning, and what the relationship could look like, some possible challenges that you see, and some key considerations. Big question for 4 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks. And Anne?
Thank you. Very inspiring presentation. Thank you. I'm interested to just pick your brain a bit in terms of Audrey's comment and use as well the curriculum. I'm working on something on Biesta's theory on the nature of education, the qualification, subjectification, socialization, and the whole idea of socialization towards consensus and how you can use a narrative inquiry in that regard, specifically in terms of decolonial theory, socialization and subjectification, and then maybe how we can resist this hegemony with your views. Thanks.
Two big questions, Ida.
Yeah, two big questions, very, very briefly. And I talk and talk. So e-learning, definitely I see a massive potential in it. That is not my expertise by no means, but like I mentioned, the new narrative environments. So I think that what I think is like, we really need to be examining those environments now as researchers. We need to be seeing what's going on over there in social media and everywhere else. Also, there are some wonderful ways to make this, like bring this kind of augmented reality in history learning, and I have loved what I've seen so far. But yeah, that's a very brief answer. Then the second question on Biesta's work and socialization towards consensus, how to use it in terms of, well, decolonial attitudes. Well, this is very, of course, a big one. Because whenever we are teaching something, like as teachers, we are always making normative decisions. We're always making judgments. And if I, as a teacher, make a decision that I am going to be showing narratives, and I am going to be seeking some sort of a consensus in the society, in my classroom, then I am taking this position of power, and I'm presenting certain narratives, excluding others. So here I again stress this critical reflection that the educator and teacher educators and everyone is well aware of their own big power there, and does not only push this consensus because, oh, it's a good thing to do. But then what is consensus really? And here I also think the counter narratives were like also really learning, educating oneself, and having researchers who come from perhaps more marginalized positions definitely join the discussion and give their valuable input, and actually even lead the discussion maybe.
Thank you. I think we have to wrap up now because it is 5:30 on my clock, and whatever place you've tuned in from, this is the end of the session. I'd like to warmly thank you, Ida, for coming along, for talking to us, for raising many, many questions. I hope that people will take the opportunity to talk to you about these things, but I also hope that they might take the opportunity to write about these things themselves, to think about putting them into a paper on human rights education, even to submitting a paper and engaging in a dialogue of words across the globe in that respect. Please consider Human Rights Education Review as a possible home for your research for that purpose. And thank you so much for such a stimulating discussion today. And thank everybody for coming along. I know the time doesn't suit everybody at all times. I have no idea what time in the morning it is in the Philippines, but I suspect that Felicia's got up very, very early for this session. So thank you all for joining in, and we look forward to welcoming you back to our webinar series back in September. And we will post on social media, on Twitter, and on the HRER platform the times of the sessions and our speakers for the autumn. And many of the people that Ida referred to have also spoken in this series. So if you were interested in Beata's work on sexual harassment, that's in the journal. If you were interested in many of the other topics, and Anne has published in the journal, and many of you, I hope, will think about contributing to us in the future. Thank you all so much for coming, and have a lovely evening if it's evening time, and a productive day if you've got the day ahead of you. Goodbye.